I can't promise you that my talk will be as exciting as the Duke, North Carolina game Saturday night if you watch that. But I can guarantee that it will be better than the Super Bowl Sunday. Unless you're a Seattle Seahawks fan. Okay. Wilmington played a very important role during the war, and it's usually overlooked by academic historians. There was no mention of Wilmington, blockade running, Fort Fisher, and Ken Burns' 9-hour documentary on the Civil War that came out, can you believe this? 36 years ago. But Wilmington was North Carolina's largest city in 1860. It was the busiest seaport then as now, but it will become the Confederacy's most important seaport by 1863 as a result of President Lincoln's proclamation of a blockade after the guns of Fort Sumter had cooled. Understanding, of course, that the South was a region of farmers and planters and slaves and very little factories. So Lincoln knew that the South was going to have to depend on an overseas trade network, importing or smuggling supplies through the naval blockade to sustain a war effort. So Lincoln proclaims a blockade in April. It's going to take not weeks, but years for this blockade to become effective. And early on, of course, the Confederacy would initiate a cotton embargo that did not work, but then would turn to the smuggling trade. But the government was not as interested in coastal operations, which was the domain of the Navy Department. They were interested in capturing strategic interior targets like Richmond, like Chattanooga, and eventually like Atlanta. So very little attention was paid to coastal operations, and the Confederacy eventually responded by using vessels to smuggle supplies in from overseas, particularly from Great Britain, but also France and from Belgium, Austria, and other countries. Now, Wilmington was not as important, of course, as Charleston on the Atlantic seaboard, New Orleans, Mobile on the Gulf Coast, and the Navy Department, with the support of the War Department, was able to capture New Orleans, as you know, in April of 1862, and at the same time, federal forces were able to capture and occupy 2/3 of North Carolina's coastal plain. Norfolk, of course, would be recaptured in May, but in the summer of '61, federal forces captured the Outer Banks of North Carolina, moved in and then captured Albemarle, Pamlico Sounds, the major river systems like the Roanoke, the Neuse, the Pamlico, and all of the major cities. They were within 60 miles of Wilmington, at Jacksonville, and yet did not go after Wilmington, but instead hopscotched over Wilmington to go after Charleston instead, because of course that's where the war had begun. That's where political and public interest centered, Charleston, and not Wilmington. And what that meant, of course, for these blockade running firms with offices in London and Liverpool and all of the southern seaports, as well as in Richmond, that meant that they could operate primarily at Wilmington by way of Bermuda, Nova Scotia, and by way of Nassau. And ocean-going vessels, merchant vessels, would bring supplies from, say, Great Britain to these transatlantic neutral seaports where they were offloaded and put onto smaller vessels for the final dash through the naval blockade. And Wilmington became so important because of geography. It was the only seaport that had two entryways. Old Inlet to the south, the main entryway today, and New Inlet, carved by a hurricane in 1761, separated as the crow flies by 6 miles and separated by Bald Head Island and Frying Pan Shoals that stretch for 18 miles into the Atlantic Ocean, the Cape of Fear. Well, what that meant for the blockade running squadrons is they had to separate into a western squadron and an eastern squadron. And one Union naval officer said we were like a parcel of cats trying to block a rat hole that really had 2 ways in and out, and you never knew which hole the rat was going to use. So it was literally a cat and mouse game, and the mouse won 80% of the time. At Wilmington, the mouse won 80% of the time. So that's where you want to invest your money. I used to tell my students, or ask them, how did Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind make his fortune? As a blockade runner. And then he got Scarlett O'Hara, right? And then he did give a damn. But at the end, they had no idea what Gone with the Wind was and Rhett Butler, so I knew it was time to retire. Move on. So blockade running became the big industry at Wilmington, and on any given day you went down to the waterfront, you might see North Carolina's blockade runner, Advance, not named for Governor Zebulon B. Vance. It was the Advance, formerly the steam vessel Lord Clyde. And she made 16 runs through the blockade before she was finally captured, with the understanding that 2 runs through the blockade would pay for the ships and cargoes. Everything else was pure gravy. It was a very lucrative trade if you were good, and if you were a successful sea captain, name your price. You were the LeBron James of the blockade running trade. These goods were put onto railroads to be sent to the battlefront, principally in Virginia, but also into the Carolinas, principally on the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad, which ran from Wilmington to Goldsboro to Weldon, or basically Rocky Mount today, where it connected with the Petersburg and Weldon Railroad, which became Robert E. Lee's main supply route by 1863. It became increasingly important as the war progresses. So, to protect the vital trade, engineers built a vast network of fortifications to protect the entryways that the blockade runners used, the blockade runners themselves, the city, which was located 28 miles upstream from Old Inlet, but also 9 miles east of Wrightsville Beach, so far out of range of Union naval bombardment, unlike Charleston. And to protect the railroads, of course, that the goods were sent to the needy, and particularly the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad. Now, Saturday, you'll visit Fort Anderson on the other side, which was the main fortification that protected the interior of the lower Cape Fear and the Cape Fear water approaches if Union forces ever breached the inlets. It's a magnificent fort, unlike Fort Fisher, which is still incredible. About 90% of this earthen fortification is still there, and it is absolutely fabulous. Jim McKee, sitting over here, is the site manager, and he'll lead you on that tour as well as at Fort Caswell. But Fort Fisher became the main fortification. It was not the key to the defense of Wilmington, but it became the main fortification that guarded Wilmington, and you can ask me about that later. So it was built at the end of New Hanover County, which is pie-shaped. It ends at Federal Point, or what Southerners renamed Confederate Point during the war. And Fort Fisher was built to protect the ships that use New Inlet, the northern entryway into the Cape Fear River. It would take 3.5 years of construction to build this mighty fortification that had a northern land front and a sea face line of batteries that provided covering fire for the blockade runners as they approached New Inlet, and the land front to the north would guard the fort against enemy ground assault. Massive fortification with elevated gun batteries, and we'll tour that and can get into the depth of the battle tomorrow on our tour. this portion of the fort is still left. Federals were so impressed when they captured it in 1865 that they contracted with a photographer to come down, who spent about 3 days here making a photographic record of Fort Fisher, T.H. O'Sullivan. And most of the fort is now washed away, but this is one of the sections, Shepherd's Battery, that is still there. And again, tomorrow we'll take a look at that. So this was a massive fortification that was considered impregnable. Union sailors on board blockading ships offshore said it was more work than the pyramids of Egypt. They really worked night and day on this fortification. And armed it with the state-of-the-art artillery. This is an 8-inch, 150-pounder Armstrong that was manufactured in England, smuggled through the blockade in August of '64 on board a vessel called the Hope. There is a replica of it outside, which we'll take a look at tomorrow. But this was a magnificent weapon that was mounted on a rosewood and mahogany carriage with brass furniture. This trunnion wheel is made of brass. What I love about this photograph, which is on the sea face, this thing was located about 2/3 of the way down the sea face, and it fired an 8-inch shell that weighed 150 pounds, thus the nomenclature. But what I love is that you can see the land face batteries in the rear. So that's just one of the O'Sullivan photographs. The commander of the fort was an aristocratic lawyer and newspaper editor from Norfolk, Virginia, named William Lamb, who the North Carolina garrison was very suspicious of when he first got here. But they came to admire and respect him very, very much. And he became known as the hero of Fort Fisher from the Confederate side. Commanding the district of the Cape Fear, later the Department of the Cape Fear, for most of the war was Major General W.H.C. Whiting, West Point graduate, brilliant, had the highest grades of any cadet until Douglas MacArthur graduated in 1906. And they said he shot a mean game of marbles, too. Small in stature, they called him Little Billy, but soldiers absolutely adored him. Now, Wilmington became so important by 1864 that Robert E. Lee said, "If it falls, I cannot maintain my army." Now, you know, by the late spring and into the summer of '64, he and U.S. Grant are battling for Petersburg in a war of stalemate. Neither side, Grant launching these massive frontal assaults, unable to break through, flanking operations against the Wilmington-Weldon Railroad that don't succeed, and Lee is able to hang on largely because of the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad. Wilmington by then was the last major seaport open to trade with the outside world. So this is how important Wilmington had become by 1864. If it falls, I cannot maintain my army. Now, for most of the war, Gideon Welles, Secretary of the U.S. Navy Department, who President Lincoln called Father Neptune, understood the strategic importance of Wilmington. There had been proposals in 1862 and '63 of capturing Wilmington by occupying Bald Head Island. If they could do that and set up breaching batteries, they could control Old Inlet and New Inlet. That was the key to the defense of Wilmington, Bald Head Island. But the War Department was interested in those interior strategic targets. The Lincoln administration backed the War Department principally. Coastal operations were the domain of the Navy Department. We don't have the manpower, the resources, so pick your targets. They went after Charleston instead. And Gideon Welles said, to close the port of Wilmington is undoubtedly the most important and effective demonstration that can be made. If of less prestige than the capture of Richmond, it would be as damaging to the rebels. But better to go after Charleston because it is Satan's kingdom, as he called it. So Wilmington was left alone. Blockade running firms that had operated at Charleston, Savannah, changed to Wilmington, which became the closest major seaport to the Virginia battlefront. That's why Wilmington became not only the most important seaport in the Confederacy, but I argue the most important city in the Confederacy by late 1864. Okay, now everything changed when Admiral Farragut closed Mobile Bay, the last seaport open to trade with the outside world in the Gulf of Mexico, in early August of 1864. Now, only Brownsville, way down in Texas, was the only port open, but it was of never mind to operations in the Eastern Theater after the Confederacy had been carved up by 1864, as you know. Gideon Welles rushed to the White House, trying to get President Lincoln to support an attack on Wilmington now. And this time Lincoln agreed. He gave Welles the green light. Why? It was an election year, and Lincoln was not faring well in the polls, the Gallup polls. No, Gallup wasn't around in those days, but you know what I'm saying. He had told members of his inner circle that summer that he would not be returned to the White House unless the tide of victory turned in favor of the Union, and fast. And so a victory at Wilmington might help him politically. So he gave Welles the green light. So Welles goes and tries to find a commander that would take over a naval task force to attack Wilmington, but Grant was not excited about this. He was totally indifferent to going after Wilmington. He wanted more men to attack Lee at Petersburg and was unwilling to give up the estimated 10,000 men for an expeditionary force to go after Wilmington. But he also understood Lincoln's political dilemma. And if Lincoln lost the election to whom? George McClellan, then Grant's out of a job. McClellan would be commander-in-chief of the nation, but would also retake command of the armies, the Union armies, from which he had been fired by Lincoln not once, but twice. So that's why Grant said, I'll give up the men when the time is right. Well, in the meantime, Sherman captures Atlanta on September the 2nd. Phil Sheridan is engaged in a successful scorched earth campaign in the Shenandoah Valley. And so the fall or the sealing of Mobile Bay, the capture of Atlanta, Phil Sheridan's operations turned the tables. And now people re-elect Lincoln, who is determined to end the war, not at the negotiation table, as the Democrats want, but on the battlefield. This will be a soldier's victory or defeat. And Lincoln was behind him. So, going through a myriad of naval officers, Welles finally settled on David Dixon Porter, who was brash, arrogant, egotistical, like some leaders are, but very capable. He was the guy that you wanted by your side in a barroom brawl. He was the Mike Tyson of the United States Navy, kid you not. And while Welles said this guy would trample over his brother officers and even his own mother, he is probably the best man for the service. And so he would assemble the largest fleet in American history up to that point, 150 ships, from which he would pick 64 warships, including 5 ironclads, to go after Fort Fisher. Grant, now on board, selects Major General Godfrey Weitzel to be the commander of the expeditionary force. But all of his memos to Weitzel goes through his commanding officer, Benjamin Butler, who you all know, Spoons Butler from New Orleans, who had argued with David Porter over the capture of New Orleans, been very critical of Porter's role in his foster brother David Farragut's Navy. And Porter was not one to ever forget. He held a grudge. And now Butler finagles his way into taking over command of the expeditionary force that was going to attack Fort Fisher. Weitzel would later say, I never even knew that Grant had given me command. I thought it was Butler. because Butler never informed Weitzel of that command. So Butler freely admitted that there was a lot of antagonism between he and Porter. In fact, in his post-war memoir, Butler wrote, "David Porter hates me like the devil hates holy water." And yet it was going to require perfect harmony between the two service branches to capture the Confederacy's strongest seacoast fortification that guarded not just the most important seaport, but the most important city in the Confederacy. If Wilmington falls, I cannot maintain my army. So, off they go. Politics of command haunted the Confederacy as well. Whiting had built a vast network of fortifications, the envy of every seaport along the Atlantic seaboard and the Gulf coasts. He was the brains behind Beauregard at Charleston in '61. He goes to Wilmington. He builds this incredible fortification network, including Fort Fisher. But on the eve of the attack, Jefferson Davis sends his personal military advisor, his principal advisor, remember, is Robert E. Lee, but his personal advisor, Braxton Bragg, who had resigned in disgrace from the Army of Tennessee in '63, brought to Richmond to serve with Jefferson Davis. And now Davis decides to send Bragg to command at Wilmington because of the suspicions of Whiting, who had a reputation for being a tipster at inopportune times, which was not true. And the change of command sparked a firestorm of controversy. In fact, when the Virginia media caught wind that Bragg was to take command at Wilmington, headlines read, "Goodbye Wilmington," showing what little faith Southerners had in Braxton Bragg as a commander who was considered, quote, "not a fighting general." A good organizer and administrator, but not a fighting general. Chickamauga was a perfect example. Okay, so the Expeditionary Force finally departs in mid-December to attack Wilmington. The first naval attack on Fort Fisher was the largest naval bombardment of the Civil War. In 2 days, more than 20,000 shot and shell were thrown at this fortification, the likes of which had never been seen before. However, the fire was ineffective and diffuse because the Navy concentrated its fire on the Confederate flags inside the fort, which were the most visible targets. And we'll talk more about that on our tour tomorrow. And Colonel Lamb moved the flags to the back end of the fort, and sure enough, the fire of the fleet was redirected in that position. So at least a third of all of the shells that the fleet fired at the fort went over the fort and into the Cape Fear River behind. The Confederates responded with limited ammunition and gunpowder about every 30 minutes, just to let the fleet know that we're still here. No ship was sunk by the fire of the fort. If they got into trouble, they were pulled out of line. An incredible bombardment from both sides that could be heard as far away as Wilmington, 20 miles upstream. Union troops land with Godfrey Weitzel at their head and do a forced reconnaissance of the fort, only to discover that all of the cannons mounted along the land front batteries guarding the land across which the Army would have to attack were still in place. So to attack would have been murderous, Weitzel concluded, not unlike Battery Wagner at Charleston in '63. So he recommended that they abort the mission. And Butler agreed and sailed back to Virginia with his troops, although he left behind about 650 on shore that later had to be rescued. As long as Butler escaped, that was okay. Got back to Virginia, and of course, Porter was infuriated. He thought that his bombardment had softened the fort enough for the troops just to walk in and take over. That had not been the case. And so both sides blamed each other. There was a congressional investigation, which Butler was excoriated. But what good came out of this was that Grant, with Lincoln's blessing, fired Butler, sent him home to Lowell, Massachusetts, as Sherman said, to his factory girls, and he was out of the picture. But still, Wilmington was open to blockade runners. Blockade runners came and went, bringing in supplies for Lee's army. Wilmingtonians were so appreciative of the great victory that they presented Braxton Bragg with a brand new wool uniform. He staged a grand review of a division of troops that General Lee had sent from Petersburg to Wilmington to make sure it remained in safe hands. Major General Robert F. Hoke, who looked like a young Robert E. Lee, arrived with 4 brigades of troops, 6,400 troops, to safeguard Wilmington. But instead of keeping them within proximity of Fort Fisher after the Federal fleet sailed away, Bragg brought them to Wilmington and staged a grand review for appreciative citizens on January the 12th, 1865. And that night, the Federal fleet returned. Just as Lamb and Whiting had predicted, they were certain the Federals would return sooner than later. But Bragg was convinced, no, having spent so much time, money, and energy on this failed attack, they would instead concentrate elsewhere, maybe more resources at Charleston. But now, 2.5 weeks later, they're back. Why? Why did Grant renew the attack on Fort Fisher? Because the defeat at Fort Fisher had been offset by a grand Union victory 300 miles to the south when William Sherman captured Savannah. After leaving Atlanta, which he had captured in September, left it in November, marched all the way across Georgia, captured Savannah on December 21st, presented it to President Lincoln as a Christmas gift. Grant, for his part, was glad to see Sherman on the seacoast and planned to transfer his 60,000-man Legion by sea to southeastern Virginia to bolster his army for one final push against Robert E. Lee. But having successfully marched to the sea, Sherman proposed instead to march to Virginia by way of the Carolinas. He said, my men are eager to get into South Carolina and make that state howl for starting this damn war. And I will not deny them that opportunity. And I will destroy railroad depots, railroads, supply caches, infrastructures, plantations, farms, whatever it takes. And then I will march through the Carolinas to Goldsboro on the Wilmington-Weldon Railroad. Sever the Wilmington-Weldon Railroad. From there, I can go to Wilmington if necessary, Raleigh to the west, or preferably go up the Wilmington-Weldon Railroad and hit Robert E. Lee in the belly. While you attack him from the east, I hit him from the underside. We could push him out into the open, converge on him, defeat him, and bring this 4 long years bloody conflict to an end. And Grant said, I would not have trusted that movement to any other general officer but William T. Sherman. So Grant authorizes Sherman's northern expedition and said, step off as quickly as possible. But to assure the success of Sherman's so-called Carolinas campaign, Grant wanted to provide him a haven halfway between Savannah and Petersburg where Sherman could retreat if he got into trouble, or better yet, from where Grant could send reinforcements and supplies to Sherman if he could make it to North Carolina. And where might that place be? Wilmington. The railroads, the Cape Fear River was navigable all the way to Fayetteville, 90 miles into the interior above Wilmington. It was the ideal place to support Sherman's northern expedition. And that's why Grant, indifferent to the first attack, was all on board on the second attack. So he supported and authorized the so-called Northern Expedition as a means of supporting General Sherman's Carolinas campaign. And that's absolutely crucial to understanding why there was a second Battle of Fort Fisher. Butler out of the way, Grant assigns Alfred H. Terry, 24th Army Corps, to command. Easygoing, affable, played the flute, nice guy, and would get along well with the mercurial David Porter. So he said, always trust Porter's judgment. And they worked in perfect harmony together, unlike Butler and Porter. On the expeditionary force would be 3,300 U.S. colored troops in 2 brigades. They would play a vital role, not so much in the Battle of Fort Fisher, because they would protect the defensive line between Fort Fisher and Sugarloaf, but they would lead the attack on Wilmington after the fall of Fort Fisher, which we'll talk about when we go to Sugarloaf and Forks Road tomorrow. But this is a company of the 4th U.S. Colored Troops, and you can see the pride and determination in the faces of these young men. They're ready to fight. They want to prove themselves. So the fleet returns on January the 12th. Bragg's got Hoke's division in Wilmington, 20 miles to the north. Early the following morning, Terry sends his men ashore, now upwards to 9,600, with no opposition. There are no Confederates to stop the landing. In fact, the Union soldiers said it was like a frolic in the park. We found a herd of deer that we slaughtered, and we cooked steaks, and we harvested oysters, and it was like a picnic. We had a grand old time. And it would not be until the afternoon of the 13th before Bragg got down to Sugarloaf, 4.5 miles north of Fort Fisher, which was a line that had been built to prevent the Federals from coming ashore to begin with, because Whiting had pointed out exactly where the Federals would come ashore, and yet there were no troops there to oppose them. So they land, and this really was the beginning of the end. Even Whiting said, if they're allowed to come ashore and establish a beachhead, the fall of Fort Fisher and Wilmington are but a matter of time. So it was the beginning of the end. The bombardment under David Porter was the second largest of the war. Only 600 fewer shot and shell were thrown at the fort than in the first attack. In other words, in the 2 attacks, more than 40,000 projectiles were thrown at this fort. And there are still thousands buried in this underground inside the fort. So I love this Currier and Ives. The Currier and Ives lithograph of the Battle of Fort Fisher. That's how important Fort Fisher was in 1865, that even Currier and Ives, that did these pastoral winter, spring, summer scenes, did not 1 but 2 lithographs of Fort Fisher. You could have gone into an art gallery 6 weeks after the Battle of Fort Fisher in January of '65 and purchased that lithograph. Amazing. Well, after 2.5 days of effective bombardment, with Admiral Porter telling his gunboat commanders, concentrate your fire along the land front to destroy, dismantle the artillery that guards the ground across which the Army will attack. And that's what they did. Only 1 8-inch Columbiad survived that massive bombardment. So when the Federal Army finally attacked late on the afternoon of January the 15th, they only had to contend with the garrison. Artillerists that came out of their bomb proofs to now fight as infantry. Now, they'd been trained in small arms weaponry, but now they're fighting as infantry and not artillery, because their artillery is gone. And here's the Federal Army attacking on the west end. And as they attacked there, Admiral Porter, who had sent ashore 2,261 sailors and Marines, attacked where the land and sea faces met at the Northeast Bastion. So this was a dual attack. This turned out to be a slaughterhouse, because Porter armed the sailors only with revolvers and cutlasses. And they're going up against 500 Confederates standing up on top of the parapet with rifle muskets that were capable of, an effective range of fire of up to 500 yards. And Lamb said within 25 minutes we had killed or wounded about 300 sailors and Marines, and witnessed something that had never been seen in American history before, the rout of U.S. Marines. And they retreated up the beach. And as far as I know, it's the only time in Marine Corps history that they ever abandoned a beachhead, was at Fort Fisher. So this turned out to be a diversionary assault for the Army. And after Whiting and Lamb, who personally directed the defense of the Northeast Bastion, turned and looked west down the land front, they saw that Union battle flags had already been planted on the parapet, on the traverses. Whiting personally led a counterattack down the land front, sword out, wearing his general's uniform, slammed into a Union color bearer at the 4th Traverse. I'll point out where the fight took place tomorrow. And while they were grappling, Union soldiers recognized him as a general officer and shot him to wound him. But before they could get to him, his men got to him and took him to the post hospital. Colonel Lamb organized a counterattack about 30 minutes later, and he too was dangerously wounded. And so now it became a soldier's fight. And you know, for 5.5 hours, there was hand-to-hand fighting, mostly in the darkness. The battlefield illuminated by the fire of musketry and light artillery. But other than that, no one was carrying torches, because you would make a perfect target. The battle was fought largely in the dark. But finally, outgunned, outmanned, outlasted, the Confederates abandoned the fort and went south to Battery Buchanan, where they had to await their fate, hoping to be taken to the west side of the Cape Fear River by boats. The commander at Battery Buchanan, at the tip of Federal Point, took off with all the boats. The sailors and Marines managed to escape, but the garrison was captured, and some 2,000 of them ended up in federal prisons. 1,200 of them ended up at Elmira, and 42% of them died before the war was over. 42%. They have to be counted among the casualties too. Those Southern boys couldn't stand that cold weather in New York. Well, Bragg telegraphed Richmond and Raleigh to let the president and Lee and Governor Vance know that sadly Fort Fisher had fallen, unexpectedly. The president immediately shot back, counterattack, take the fort. We have to have Wilmington. Bragg refused. Instead, he abandoned the forts at the mouth of the river, and you'll go to Fort Caswell on Saturday, and retreated to Fort Anderson, directly across from the Sugarloaf lines, where we'll go tomorrow. And the idea was that, well, now I'll protect Wilmington. Well, what good was Wilmington now that the harbor had been sealed to blockade running? Bragg he didn't get it. Well, Porter then put onto the Cape Fear River a flotilla of about 30 vessels, most of them double enders, because the Cape Fear River is narrow and comparatively shallow. So these vessels don't have turning basins except in the estuary. So to go upriver, they've got to be double enders, meaning they have rudders on both ends. And remember, Wilmington was the objective. Fort Fisher was the launching pad to attack and capture Wilmington for the river and the railroads in support of Sherman. Grant was so determined to capture Wilmington that on January the 28th, he came to the Cape Fear and held a war council with Admiral Porter and General Terry on board Porter's flagship Malvern, and discussed the best way to capture Wilmington. And while the Federals had reconnoitered Sugarloaf and discovered it was really strong and there were going to be a lot of casualties if they launched a frontal assault against Sugarloaf, they thought the best way was to go across the Cape Fear River, where there was more elbow room on the mainland, to attack Fort Anderson. A strong fort, but that was the best way. So Grant said, good, It is the best and only way to capture Wilmington, attack Fort Anderson. So Grant authorizes the attack on Fort Anderson, where you'll go on Saturday. So reinforcements arrive in early February. Federals are stationed at Fort Fisher and just above, keeping Hope, whose three or four brigades are at Sugarloaf. Another brigade has been sent over to Fort Anderson to reinforce the North Carolinians, who have been garrisoning the forts at the mouth of the river. They retreat up here. Reinforcements arrive in Fort Fisher. Some are transferred across the river to go up and attack Fort Anderson, while Sugarloaf is held in check. Fort Anderson would come under attack for 3 days. This is a fanciful view of Fort Anderson, but gives you an idea of how strong the fort was. And it would undergo an attack from the 17th, principally until 17th and 18th. The fort was abandoned early on the 19th of February. And it was so important to capture Fort Anderson, which you probably have never heard about unless you're from this area, was so important to final Union victory that it was the front page of the New York Herald in February of 1865. Look at that. But very quickly becomes back page news because of Sherman's successful campaign, end of the war, and President Lincoln's assassination. But in February of '65, Fort Anderson, the capture of Wilmington, were extremely important. Well, the evacuation of Fort Anderson meant that General Hoke had to evacuate Sugarloaf, because now the federal fleet could get further upriver and land troops on the east side to attack Sugarloaf from the north. So the Confederates are retreating upriver, up both sides, with Admiral Porter's flotilla moving steadily up the river to support the two wings of the Union Army chasing the Confederates toward Wilmington. The Confederates would make one last stand at what I call the Battle of Forks Road, about 3 miles south of Wilmington, and the principal Union combatants were U.S. colored troops, as they had been throughout the campaign after the fall of Fort Fisher on the east side of the Cape Fear River. They were the principal combatants at the Battle of Sugarloaf. They were the principal combatants at the Battle of Forks Road. And we'll talk more about that on our tour tomorrow. Wilmington would be captured on February 22nd, 1865, George Washington's birthday. A good sign, right? My youngest daughter got married last year on February 22nd, and I told her I was going to say in my talk, my dad talk, to the crowd, oh yeah, that's right, you got married the same day that the Yankees captured Wilmington in 1865. Oh, Daddy, please don't say that. Please. Did I? Yeah. Of course I did. Right. And she will never let me forget that either. Well, what that meant, of course, was that blockade running had ended. No longer were ships bringing vital, essential supplies for Robert E. Lee's army able to get to Wilmington's docks for transfer to the Wilmington-Weldon Railroad. As Lee had predicted, if Wilmington falls, I cannot maintain my army. And sure enough, 46 days after Wilmington fell, Robert E. Lee surrendered to U.S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. And that 4 years long bloody war finally came to an end. So while you may hear little about Wilmington among academic historians and in national documentaries, it played a vital role in the Civil War history of this great nation. And I thank y'all for listening to me this morning.
Chris, I gotta tell you, buddy, you're on it.
Was that 40 minutes?
No, you're perfect. You got 12 minutes for Q&A.
Oh man, I tell you what.
I mean, it's good to have a speaker.
That was the fastest I have ever done that in my, believe me.